What if I told you the reason he's losing interest isn't because you're too much, but because you're feeding his ego instead of challenging it? The truth is, the moment you stop clapping for the performance and start requiring presence, everything changes. He doesn't need more compliments, he needs a mirror. And the woman who stops praising the mask is the woman who makes him take it off. Stay with me, because the second you shift your energy, you become unforgettable. When control becomes comfortable, it starts to feel like a right, not a privilege. The moment that pattern is disrupted, there's resistance. But that resistance isn't a reason to fold, it's a sign of the hold the illusion had. Boundaries don't scream, they whisper with calm certainty. They say, "This is where I end, and where your influence no longer shapes me." It's easy to mistake kindness for weakness, but the quiet power of self-respect changes everything. Not reacting, not chasing, not begging. Those are actions that carry weight. The absence of validation unsettles entitlement, and that space is where real connection has a chance to begin again. There's a difference between affection and attachment. One flows freely, the other clings for survival. When validation becomes the currency for keeping peace, the relationship stops being authentic. It becomes performant. Detaching from that dynamic doesn't mean becoming cold or unfeeling. It means making peace with being misunderstood while standing your ground. It means not shrinking to fit the mold that makes others comfortable. That discomfort you create by not feeding ego, that's the space where respect begins to grow. Being deeply rooted in your worth naturally confronts entitlement, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. When patterns are broken, identity feels threatened. But it's not your job to soothe someone's fear of losing control. Your job is to stay aligned with your truth. That means not responding to guilt, silence, or manipulation tactics. That means being okay with awkward silences, even if they feel heavy, because silence can speak louder than begging for change. The strongest moves are often the ones you don't explain. People get used to your reactions. But when you stop reacting, the game changes, the rules reset, and that pause demands introspection, not more performance. Pulling away from dynamics that exhaust your energy is not cruelty, it's preservation. When love becomes tied to pleasing, pleasing becomes survival. But love should not cost your peace. It should not feel like constant work to be seen or respected. The moment you realize this, the power shifts. You no longer try to manage someone else's insecurities or moods. You stop blaming yourself for someone else's inconsistency, and with that clarity, your energy returns to you. That reclamation is magnetic. It disrupts ego, because ego can't survive without control. The mirror you hold up by standing your ground reflects more than defiance, it reflects truth. And truth, especially when delivered through self-worth, is hard to argue with. It doesn't shout, it doesn't try to convince, it just is. And that just is has power. When someone expects you to fold and you don't, they're forced to reevaluate. Maybe not out loud, maybe not quickly, but internally something shifts. Because now you're not just a presence, they have to rise to meet. You've become a standard. Control thrives on predictability. Ego loves knowing exactly what button to push. But when you become unpredictable, not emotionally erratic, but grounded and unavailable to drama, the dynamic changes. Suddenly, the old tricks stop working. The push and pull loses its charm, and the only way forward becomes emotional maturity. You're no longer reactive, you're reflective. You don't fight for clarity, you embody it. And in doing so, you force those around you to choose between growth or distance. That choice isn't yours to make. Yours is to stay firm in truth. There's a quiet revolution that happens when you stop over-explaining your worth. The desire to be understood fades, and what rises in its place is peace. Not everyone deserves access to your softness, especially when that softness has been taken for granted. Protecting your energy doesn't mean you love less. It means you love wisely. It means your time, affection, and support are reserved for the emotionally present. This shift creates tension, but it's the kind of tension that births respect. Ego may resist it at first, but deep down it recognizes real strength. When distance replaces dependence, perspective sharpens. Clarity arrives, not in the noise of conflict, but in the stillness of space. That space isn't a punishment, it's an invitation to reflect. Not everything needs closure when you have composure. And composure doesn't come from being cold, it comes from caring deeply, but not at your own expense. People learn quickly what they stand to lose when you stop showing up for dysfunction. The message is subtle but loud. If you want access, bring presence, not performance. And that expectation speaks louder than words. Your silence can be louder than any speech. Your distance can teach more than any lecture. You don't need to explain why your peace matters. You just need to protect it. When you stop participating in power games, the energy shifts. What once looked like strength in others begins to look like insecurity. Because the real strength is walking away from cycles that drain you. And that departure is felt, not just seen. You don't have to announce your growth. Growth makes its presence known through absence. Absence of drama, absence of reactivity, absence of desperation. There is something deeply attractive about a person who doesn't flinch under pressure. Not because they're numb, but because they know their value isn't negotiable. This kind of energy breaks ego, not with cruelty, but with calm. It's the kind of energy that says, I'm not here to fix, chase, or prove. It's quiet, but undeniable. And it demands either transformation or departure. That's not manipulation. Not all love requires pain to create change. Often it's not about walking away with bitterness, it's about stepping back with wisdom. When behavior repeats itself at the expense of your peace, it's not your role to fix it. You are not responsible for patterns that drain your energy or steal your joy. Calling out those patterns doesn't make you harsh, it makes you conscious. Every time you stop tolerating what confuses or belittles you, you shift the emotional tone. Growth isn't born from comfort, it rises from disruption. But not all disruption has to be loud. Sometimes it's the quiet refusal to engage that echoes the loudest, and in that space something deeper gets confronted. Affection does not mean agreement. Love does not mean blind acceptance. Challenging a toxic dynamic is not an attack, it's a boundary. When someone expects devotion without effort, it's a pattern, not partnership. Breaking that pattern doesn't require rage, it requires restraint. When you calmly withdraw your energy from what doesn't feel right, you stop rewarding dysfunction. You don't need to criticize or belittle. You only need to remove the fuel from the fire. Some lessons are only learnt in absence, not explanation. And when you no longer feed the cycle stops spinning. Stepping back is not the same as giving up. It's choosing not to carry the emotional weight that was never yours to begin with. You can care deeply and still say no. You can feel love and still say this isn't working for your spirit. Not everything can be fixed by staying silent or smiling through disrespect. Sometimes it takes breaking the flow to create space for reflection. When you detach from behavior that drains you, you protect not just your heart, but your future. The longer you stay in cycles that don't change, the more you lose parts of yourself. Detachment is not cold, it's self-preservation. And in that space, transformation has a chance. Emotional accountability is the foundation of any real connection. Without it, love becomes lopsided and heavy. When only one side is doing the emotional lifting, the bond starts to fray. You can't build connection on promises without action. Growth requires discomfort, and it often begins when someone stops shielding others from it. You're not punishing, you're refusing to enable. That shift can feel radical, especially to those used to being cushioned from consequences. But your energy is not infinite, and your peace is not disposable. When you honor your feelings instead of suppressing them, you invite depth. And that invitation doesn't beg, it simply exists, waiting to be met. It's tempting to keep showing up, hoping consistency will inspire change. But sometimes your consistency is what enables the problem to continue. When your presence becomes predictable despite poor treatment, you stop being appreciated. You start being expected. That's when love becomes leverage. That's when care turns into currency. When you finally step back, it confuses the system. It interrupts the rhythm. It makes someone question the foundation they stood on. And if that foundation was built on convenience, the cracks will show quickly. But if it's built on respect, your boundary will become a wake-up call, not a wall. There's a difference between love and tolerance. Love is expansive. Tolerance, when overused, becomes a trap. When you constantly excuse actions that hurt you, you're not being strong. You're being silent in your own suffering. And silence, in this case, is mistaken for permission. You teach others how to treat you by what you allow, what you overlook, and what you continue to show up for. When you break that pattern by withdrawing your energy, everything recalibrates. You create emotional gravity. The absence becomes a mirror. And only then can you truly see what was real and what was routine. Real connection doesn't fear challenge. It grows from it. If the bond can't survive your truth, then it was never strong enough to begin with. Avoiding uncomfortable conversations or shifts only prolongs the decay. You can love someone and still hold them accountable to a higher version of themselves, but they have to choose that version. You can't drag them there. The most powerful statement you can make is not through argument, it's through your absence from chaos. When you no longer participate in dysfunction, the dysfunction loses its power. And in that stillness, the message is clear: evolve or exit. People often confuse peacekeeping with peacemaking. Peacekeeping suppresses your truth to avoid tension. Peacemaking speaks your truth even if it causes tension. The latter is where growth happens. Avoiding conflict doesn't create harmony, it creates resentment. When you withhold your boundaries to keep someone close, you lose parts of yourself. But when you finally stand firm, you stop betraying your own needs. That act of self-respect invites others to meet you there, or move out of your way. You don't need to threaten, you don't need to explain. Your shift in energy is explanation enough. Energy doesn't lie. You can say all the right words, but if your energy stays present in patterns that don't serve you, the cycle continues. The shift begins the moment you act differently. When you no longer chase, explain, or defend, you reclaim your power. That doesn't mean you've stopped caring, it means you've started caring more about yourself. Your silence becomes sacred. Your space becomes selective. Your standards become non-negotiable. And suddenly, what once seemed impossible becomes necessary. Not because you demanded it, but because you no longer enabled the alternative. Choosing not to punish doesn't mean accepting anything. It means your standard is no longer up for debate. You can correct without cruelty. You can lead with grace, not ego. But grace still draws a line. When you protect your energy, you stop being the safety net for others' emotional immaturity. And in doing so, you become a mirror that reflects both the beauty of connection and the cost of neglect. Not through anger, but through absence. Not through revenge, but through renewal. And that renewal starts the moment you stop feeding what drains you. Emotional independence is the most powerful kind of magnetism. It's not about pretending not to care, it's about caring without losing yourself in the process. The ability to walk away doesn't come from coldness, it comes from clarity. When someone knows that your world doesn't collapse without their presence, the dynamic changes instantly. You're no longer seeking approval, you're embodying confidence. That confidence isn't loud or aggressive, it's calm, steady, and undeniable. It shows up in the way you set boundaries, in the way you don't tolerate confusion, and in the way you keep your peace sacred. The energy of knowing you can leave if you're not valued makes your presence more meaningful. And that kind of presence can't be faked. It's felt. When you operate from a place of self-worth, you stop competing for space in someone's life. You stop performing for affection or negotiating your needs just to stay relevant. You show up whole, and you expect to be met with the same wholeness. It's not about arrogance, it's about not shrinking. When your life is already rich with purpose, joy, and fulfillment, you don't chase anyone to fill a void. You're not looking to be saved, you're looking to be matched. That energy doesn't beg for attention, it commands respect. And when someone realizes that your heart isn't up for sale, they begin to value it differently. Because you are not easily swayed, you are not easily impressed, you are grounded. The willingness to walk away is what gives your words power. You're no longer pleading to be seen, you're simply stating your truth. And the moment that truth is not honored, you have the strength to step back without hesitation. You don't use distance as a game. It's a form of emotional hygiene. You recognize when the connection is draining you instead of nourishing you, and you act accordingly. This isn't punishment, it's protection, not from others, but from the version of yourself that tolerates less than you deserve. That shift may cause discomfort for others, but that discomfort is where real growth begins. Because walking away isn't abandonment, it's alignment. Because we don't have time for the emotional tunnels. It's alignment. Being able to detach with grace doesn't make you heartless, it makes you emotionally intelligent. You're not reacting, you're responding. You're not caught in drama, you're watching patterns. And when those patterns show you that your energy is not being met with respect, you adjust. That adjustment doesn't have to be cruel. It can be subtle. A pullback, a silence, a redirect of your attention to what actually serves your peace. When you stop giving energy to what confuses you, clarity begins to bloom. And that clarity is what breaks cycles that once had a grip on your spirit. Because now your focus is your power, not your fear of being alone. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing your life is already full of purpose, full of self-love, full of boundaries. You no longer settle for breadcrumbs of effort. You no longer justify inconsistencies. Your standard is no longer about potential, it's about presence. And presence isn't just physical, it's emotional, mental, spiritual. When someone can't meet you in those spaces, you don't force the connection, you release it. Not out of bitterness, but out of deep self-trust. Because you've learned that your peace is worth more than temporary comfort. That kind of energy isn't loud, but it leaves an impact that lingers long after you leave the room. That kind of energy isn't loud, but it leaves an impact that lingers long after you leave the room. That kind of energy isn't loud, but it leaves an impact that lingers long after you leave the room. There's nothing more powerful than a woman who can choose herself without apology. Not in rebellion, but in alignment. Not in anger, but in wisdom. She walks with the knowledge that her worth is not tied to anyone else's attention. She doesn't chase closure, she becomes it. She doesn't need to prove her value, she embodies it. And when someone fails to recognize what she brings, she doesn't beg them to see it. She simply moves forward with grace. That movement creates a ripple that disrupts the pattern of being taken for granted. Because when you become your own source, you stop settling for being someone's option. Emotional detachment is not about not feeling. It's about not losing yourself in the feeling. It's about being able to observe without absorbing, to love deeply without clinging, to give generously without demanding in return. That kind of energy requires strength. It requires the ability to sit with discomfort without making impulsive decisions. You've trained yourself not to chase reassurance, You've taught your heart how to be whole without constant validation. And that strength radiates in everything you do. In how you speak, in how you walk away, in how you no longer fight for the bare minimum. That's not indifference. That's power. When you stop tolerating emotional inconsistency, you become a mirror that reflects back the truth of what you deserve. You don't need to explain why you're stepping back. Your actions do the talking. Your boundaries are not up for debate. And the moment someone feels entitled to your softness without offering stability, you protect your spirit, not by building walls, but by building standards. Your energy becomes more refined, more selective, and in that selectiveness, your value multiplies. Because what is rare is not what begs to be kept, it's what chooses to walk if not cherished. The strength to walk away doesn't come overnight. It's built through experience, through moments of overgiving, through lessons of unmet expectations, through the pain of being too available for the wrong energy. But each of those moments taught you something. They taught you how to return to yourself, how to anchor your worth internally, how to be complete, not waiting to be completed. That journey isn't easy, but it's sacred. It's where you learn that your love is a gift, not a currency, and that whoever receives it should be deeply present, not casually entertained. To be able to leave a situation not because you stopped loving, but because you started loving yourself more, that's the mark of someone who's done the work, who knows the value of their time, their heart, their presence, and who refuses to pour endlessly into people who are not emotionally available. That kind of strength doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be consistent. Because the moment you stop convincing and start choosing, everything changes. And this is with a special careful parent in everything. I mean this in such deep and lasting ways that it never comes at a cost. And who refuses to pour your energy becomes more powerful than any words. And that quiet confidence is what truly sets you apart. Feeding someone's ego might make them feel powerful, but it doesn't make them feel connected. It keeps the interaction surface level, built on performance rather than presence. When every compliment is about status, when every gesture reinforces entitlement, the bond loses depth. Real emotional intimacy isn't about stroking pride, it's about seeing beneath the armor. It's in the conversations that go beyond image, beyond charm, beyond control. When you stop affirming what's hollow, you invite what's honest, not by criticizing, but by shifting your energy toward what's real. You can admire without idolizing. You can support without surrendering your truth. That's the space where authenticity replaces approval seeking. Validation should be a reflection of mutual respect, not a reward for minimal effort. When you praise what's shallow, you build a connection on sand. It collapses under pressure. But when you acknowledge depth, growth, and vulnerability, something shifts. You're no longer appealing to pride, you're appealing to presence. It's not about withholding kindness, it's about offering it where it nourishes, not enables. Every time you stop clapping for performance and start asking for presence, the tone changes. You're no longer a fan, you're a partner. That shift invites accountability, not applause. And in that space, ego has no choice but to take a back seat. Ego wants control. It thrives on predictability, on being fed, on being admired. But connection grows in the unknown, in the vulnerable, in the uncomfortable. That's why challenging ego without shaming the soul is an act of love. It says, I see you, but I won't inflate the version of you that hides. You're not there to maintain illusions. You're there to build something real. And building real means calling out what's shallow, even gently. You can be kind without being compliant. You can be warm without being walked over. That balance is what teaches others how to show up with sincerity, not performance. Refusing to feed the ego doesn't make you distant, it makes you discerning. Not every grand gesture deserves applause. Not every pretty word deserves trust. You're allowed to ask, where is the substance? You're allowed to seek consistency, not charisma. You're not cold, you're clear. You're not difficult, you're deliberate. When you stop rewarding what looks good and start requiring what feels right, your presence becomes rare. Because most people settle for the performance, but you've learned to wait for the truth. And when that truth finally shows up, it knows it's meeting someone who doesn't settle for surface. Affirmation given too easily loses its power. When every compliment is a reflex, not a reflection, it becomes noise. But when you pause, observe, and speak to what's real, your words carry weight. You're not performing affection, you're communicating value. You're showing that you see more than what someone presents. And that kind of attention doesn't inflate, it grounds. It invites others to be seen without the need for masks. That experience is rare. It can feel uncomfortable at first, but over time, it becomes the most trusted kind of connection, one that is built on honesty, not ego stroking. Choosing to connect with someone's growth over their glory is a decision rooted in self-worth. You're not here to boost status, you're here to share substance. So that doesn't mean you criticize success or ignore effort. It means you admire what's earned, not demanded. You celebrate progress, not performance. Your attention becomes selective. Your praise becomes intentional. You stop responding to shallow displays and start looking for emotional presence. And by doing so, you train others to meet you at a higher level, not through force, but through example. Because the energy you bring into a space sets the tone for how people show up. There is something magnetic about someone who won't be moved by empty words or half-hearted actions, not because they're guarded, but because they value alignment. When the ego doesn't get its usual reaction, no validation, no worship, no instant compliance, it gets rattled. But that discomfort is where transformation begins. Not everyone will rise to meet you in that space, but those who do will come not with bravado, but with authenticity, because they know you don't respond to noise, you respond to truth. And truth doesn't need decoration, it just needs consistency. That's how deep connection begins, when ego steps aside and sincerity steps in. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. No reaction, no reassurance, just stillness. Let the silence speak. Let the absence of attention reveal the emptiness of performance. When you withhold energy from what doesn't feel aligned, you create a vacuum. In that vacuum, people are forced to face their own reflection, not the one you project, but the one they've avoided. You become the catalyst for self-awareness, not through confrontation, but through discipline. You choose where your energy goes. And you understand that feeding ego might keep someone close, but starving it invites them to grow. When you no longer flatter what's false, you create space for what's true. That space is sacred. It doesn't rush, it doesn't chase, it waits, but not passively, it watches. It observes who can meet it with depth, not just with charm. That kind of presence demands a different version of the people around you. It demands commitment, presence, and focus. That kind of presence demands a different version of the people around you. It asks for their realness, their awareness, their emotional maturity. And if they can't meet you there, you don't beg, you bless and release. Because what you're building requires more than surface. It requires presence. And presence only shows up when ego gets quiet. To choose presence over ego is an act of emotional rebellion. In a world that rewards performance, you become the one who holds out for truth. You stop clapping for what looks good and start building with what feels solid. That makes you rare. That makes you powerful. Not because you're trying to change others, but because you've changed the way you show up. You don't need the noise. You don't need the act. You need real. And real doesn't shout. It resonates. It's calm. It's consistent. And when it finds you, it stays. Not to be admired, but to connect.